So it's like 30 seconds later. We're going to be trying this again. So let's get back into it, and we're going to do recreate. ZapMe 4. Create new world. It wasn't a freaking... So what have we learned? Do not freaking mess with the shoggoths. I think next time what I'm going to do is just because the part of that worked, right? So I need to see. So let's. Creaking heart is block of resin clump. Okay, cool. So it's 9. So that's the important bit. It's 9 bits of resin to a creaking heart. So going to do the exact same thing that we were doing. And I didn't realize that creeper was so deadly. I expected, ow, that hurt, but at least the creeper's gone now. Not, I'm dead. And this just gives me even more ammo to say, you know what? I'm just going to freaking walk. So, and we're going to continue where we left off.
That's for sure. If you understand that the Gospels call to you to bear the weight of tragedy and malevolence on your shoulders, along with the divine spirit that guides you, there is nothing more terrifying and no greater field of opportunity than that. And so we've got our work cut out for us, gentlemen. This is one peculiar time and one peculiar text, and I sure hope we're up to the task.
It's compelling to cast the gospel as summons to bear suffering, but that call isn't uniquely Christian. Stoics, Buddhists, and countless heroic traditions ask the same of people without invoking a divine overseer. And there's an argument that choosing courage without divine command is actually the more honorable path, doing what's right because it's right, not out of fear or promised reward.
And that's all, as far as I can tell, that's all packed into this story and more. So
I rarely comment on the production choices of the videos I'm responding to, but I'm sorry. It's not just me, right? This is Da Vinci's Last Supper painting with Peterson in the Jesus position, centered, framed by a Gothic arc, lit like a halo, and surrounded by his sycophants arranged like disciples with open Bibles. The candles, the darkness, the cathedral imagery, it all elevates him from discussion moderator to spiritual axis, the figure through whom the others receive insight. Plenty of traditions teach courage and sacrifice, but visually this scene suggests something else entirely, that Christianity, fractured as it is, finds coherence under Jordan Peterson himself. Whether intentional or not, it's not a round table. It's iconography. And just in case the introduction wasn't enough evidence that Peterson doesn't care about historical reliability of the Jesus narrative, or about biblical scholarship as a discipline, Jordan didn't even bring a Bible to read from for his 10-part seminar series on the Gospels.
So I'm going to read this. This is the Annunciation to Zechariah. One day when Zechariah's group was on duty and he was serving as a priest before God, he was chosen by...
What verse are you reading?
Luke, beginning of Luke.
Luke 1, 5 to 25. I'm hoping that's where it is. I'm using the single Gospels, by the way, in this journey forward.
So it's important to know that when Jordan is reading the gospel text, he's not actually reading from a gospel, but it's a kind of compilation of different gospels. So sometimes it starts in one gospel and then it cuts to another. And so for people that know the gospels really well, this might be a very frustrating experience. I know even for us at the table, it is a little bit of a frustrating experience.
So I structured this seminar in relationship to a book called The Single Gospel. And he describes it as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John consolidated into a single narrative. That's not an approach without its pitfalls. He compresses and retranslates many of the verses. So I'm sure there'll be something in that to offend everyone who's listening. For me, it allowed me to enter the single narrative of the Gospels relatively rapidly and to make sure that we had the appropriate narrative through line.
It should be apparent to.
Okay, so what he's doing is that he has got this gospel blended harmony that he's using. For his goals, this is completely appropriate, and yet Pelagia is probably going to slam him for it.
Anyone serious about studying the canonical Gospels that mashing 4 documents into one document is simultaneously going to erase the particular emphasis of each writer. For example, Mark wants to depict Jesus as supernaturally pain tolerant, and Luke wants to depict Jesus as suffering agony, so which one wins? But also lose any friction points that can be used to solidify that whole via confirmation, or potentially weaken the whole by introducing contradictions. A harmonized gospel necessarily removes points of consideration for and against historical verification. I'll let Bart Ehrman say more from a previous video theater.
And the mistake people make is pretending that what Mark has to say is the same thing that Luke has to say, and that what Luke has to say is the same thing that Mark has to say. These are 2 different gospels with 2 different points of view. And if you smash them together into one kind of mega gospel, you have ruined the emphasis of each one. Sometimes there are differences in emphases that really matter.
I thought that the Gospels each had a distinctive point when I was an evangelical Christian, and it wasn't because I wanted to point out contradictions. It's because I thought that there were 4 Gospels in the New Testament and not one Gospel. And each of these is a book written by a particular author. Even if you believe that God inspired each author, he inspired 4 different authors, and presumably that's because they have 4 different things to say. And if you pretend that they all mean the same thing, then you don't have any explanation for why there are 4 of them. You just write one of them. And of course, throughout the history.
Okay, so here's the thing, is that there's 2, for lack of a better word, moves that you can make, and they're both valid, right? One is nitpicking apart a story like this that's told from multiple perspectives into its individual perspectives, and that's a valid move to do. It's good. I had a boat, didn't I? No, we're making a boat. Right. So yes, we're gonna be doing lots of tree chopping. I think maybe less than last time though. But I did get important information about where that creaking heart is. Okay. I just want 4 saplings. So yeah. But okay, so that's a valid move, right? When you're studying something. But another valid move is also harmonizing the accounts and seeing what happens when you put them together, right? And Jordan Peterson's project here is very much more that harmonized. When you put all these things together, what does that tell us? Perspective, rather than the atomized perspective. The goal here is to come out with something holistic, not with something not with like to go in detail about the individual events.
History of Christianity, that's been the view. And even in the second Christian century, there was an author named Tatian who created this thing called the Diatessaron, which was Diatessaron means through the four. And what he did is he took the four gospels and he combined them into one big gospel. And so he'd take verses from Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, and they put them all together so that the same story would be longer because it'd have everything in it. But there weren't contradictions now because it was all there. And that was the gospel used in Syria for centuries. Rather than the four individual gospels, they used the Diatessaron.
And for the Christians, too, it's important because the early church, there was a debate. There was actually an early Christian who proposed a single gospel. He said, we have to take these unwieldy texts and merge them into one nice, clean, coherent text. But the church resisted that because, in some ways, they knew that the gospels were the closest accounts of the life of Jesus.
And scholars today say, well, yeah, no, that's an interesting enterprise. But when you do that, then you're not really trying to understand what Matthew, for example, is trying to teach or seeing how it's different from John. The result of seeing them as different is it's true. You do find contradictions there, but that's not the reason for doing it. The reason for doing it is because you want to see what an author says.
I think most of the people that are Christian around the table would have liked us to either pick one gospel or, follow one gospel and then supplement with another. But Jordan is really adamant on going to the single gospel.
Because he doesn't care about the details, only the meta-narrative. I feel like he'd prefer Cliff Notes or even a pamphlet if he could get away with it.
And so, in the end, what's important is we do get through the story of Jesus and, we get through the major events and the major teaching of Jesus. But even at the table, I don't know if the camera picks it up, but sometimes we're bewildered because we don't know. We're like flipping through the Bible and we don't know where we are, And so that's important to understand because even for the viewer, while you're watching it, you'll have a little bit of that experience yourself.
Yeah, it's weird. And it definitely makes the series more difficult to follow or fact check, which maybe Peterson considers a feature.
I think in a lot of ways, and we've discussed this a little bit, the uncertainty or the lack of consistency across the stories actually makes them more believable.
I agree with you.
And so if we were to reconstitute something from historical memory and every detail lines up, think about like a police investigation, right?
Everybody gets the exact same story.
Right, a bunch of guys in a heist and they have all the details in place, you're not going to believe them.
It sounds like someone on the panel has been listening to the arguments of former cold case detective turned Christian apologist, J. Warner Wallace. I know skeptics often jump on gospel contradictions, but in the police scenario, none of this would hold up in court because of the obvious collusion.
There's always variation between eyewitness accounts. And it's not something that's ever shaken me. As a matter of fact, I'm always suspicious when there isn't variation. And the only thing we ever ask the dispatcher when we get called out to a homicide is, hey, have the officers on the scene separate the eyewitnesses because I'm going to be about an hour and a half before I get there. I don't want them talking to each other because they'll just line up their stories. I want to see the messy puzzle. Because it's in that puzzling together of all the messiness that we're going to catch a bad guy.
This is an ongoing frustration I have with Detective Wallace and apologetics in general. The focus on contradictions and not the problem of corroboration. Matthew and Luke copied most of Mark, a lot of times word for extended passages. But then, surface-level apologists like Jim want to pretend that these portions of the gospel provide independent attestation. They obviously do not. And those little changes are better explained as evolving theology rather than a shift in perspective. Look at these discrepancies for yourself, but instead of asking, can these be harmonized, ask yourself, why might a later author have made this change, rather than copy it exactly. The answers can be disturbing.
And so part of this is it's a historical reconstitution, and memory works in different ways, story works in different ways, people are writing to different aims.
They had access to different sources, maybe.
Yeah, of course. That's an admission that these aren't eyewitness testimony. An eyewitness doesn't need sources.
So Elijah calls the Israelites back to conscience. John the Baptist is the forerunner and the announcer of Christ. This is the announcement of his conception and birth. And so what do we make of John the Baptist? Why is it necessary? Greg, maybe you can start us off here. Why do you think it's necessary in the narrative flow of things for there to be an unroller of the red carpet, let's say, for someone to make the way ready?
If the Gospels are history, then we don't discuss why some element is necessary for narrative flow. Either a historical figure had a ministry before Jesus that became a starting point for Jesus' ministry, or they didn't. But Peterson is actually doing here what more Christians should do. Look for parts of the story that seem necessary for a narrative flow, and potentially discount anything in the story that seems more literary than literal. It's not often in real life that events unfold exactly as an effective novelist would want them to. This is why we accept creative liberties in biopics. We know things need to be reorganized, reinterpreted, or even entirely invented in order to serve a narrative flow.
But then there's a dramatic level here too, where you need to prepare the ground for the introduction of a major character.
Yeah, and we do this all the time dramatically. You have an opening act for a concert. You have somebody
An overture.
you have an overture. You have, if there's a late night show, they'll have somebody warm up the crowd as a comedian, right? You have to set the stage.
You have to show how bad the situation is too before the hero comes in. And that's one of the things that John the Baptist does. He says, it's like the axe is at the root of the tree, folks. This is it. Things are dire. Everything, you need to repent because the fire is coming, and so everything is in a very dire state, before the main character comes in.
That's a perfect example of this working in one gospel, but not another. In Mark, the opening scene is John the Baptist, a historical figure who may well have been more famous than Jesus at the time. So using him as a reference point sense of scale for Jesus makes sense. Like the planet and the smaller ship set the scale for the opening scene of Star Wars. But this notion laughably makes no sense in Matthew, Luke, or John, and even less sense in this four-gospel combination that Peterson is using. By the time we get to John the Baptist, there's already been angels and kings and the creation of the universe, already upping the ante and setting the scale. In any gospel other than Mark, John the Baptist is anticlimactic, stripping him of his original narrative role. That's one reason I'm open to this baptism having a historical kernel, because it survived longer than its narrative need.
The baptism seems to precipitate two events. One is the sojourn in the desert, and one is the onset of the ministry. So what's your reading?
Well, this is a problem with using a deliberately harmonized version rather than the Bible itself, because Peterson is more correct than he knows. In the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus is baptized by John and then goes immediately to the desert for 40 days to be tempted by Satan. Mark 1:12 says, "At once the Spirit sent him out into the wilderness." But in the Gospel of John, Jesus is baptized by John, and in 1:35 it says, "The next day, John the Baptist saw Jesus passing by again, and he picks up some disciples." These passages can't both be right. Jesus can't have immediately left for 40 days and also still be around the next day at the baptism site.
Well, in Matthew, it's amazing, because in Matthew you really have this repetition of Exodus. We'll get to it when we talk about it. But Christ is chased into Egypt, to flee his brother, and then he comes back. When he comes back, he crosses the sea. He's baptized. Then he goes to be tempted into the desert, and then he goes up the mountain to give the new law. That's where he does the Sermon of the Mount. Yeah. And so that is really, the Christians really understand the baptism as this
40 days in the wilderness, 40 years in the wilderness.
And so when you see Christ going in the water, it's a repetition of Genesis 1. It's so clear. He goes down into the water, and then it says when he comes up, the Spirit came down upon him as a dove. It's not just the Genesis 1, it's also the end of the flood. It's the Genesis 1, it's the end of the flood, it's Joshua, it's the Israelites going to the Sinai. It's all of these images of water crossing that are in the Old Testament are recapitulated into this image of regeneration, which is the beginning of a new world. But you could say that that's ritually what it is for us. That is that when we go into the water, we come out new. It is a new birth, a new beginning, like it's being born again. All of that imagery.
All the Christians at the table correctly are making clear the references to the Old Testament, specifically the Pentateuch, the Torah.
It's great that the panel is acknowledging that the gospel writers were deliberately constructing scenes to mirror the stories of Israel escaping Egypt, and the rest of the Hebrew Bible. That's pretty much scholarly consensus. But if one admits that authors were creating literature for theological purpose, then they were not prioritizing historical reporting, or even necessarily attempting historical reporting. It's a slippery slope with no clear delineation. Allusions aren't evidence.
So another very strange occurrence happened. So after the Annunciation to John's father and mother, we have the Annunciation to Mary.
Future.
I think it's either Mary and the infant or the Whore of Babylon. I think those are the directions for women, fundamentally.
Framing women as either a symbol of purity on one hand, or chaos and temptation on the other hand, is one of the oldest patriarchal tropes in history. It turns women into moral signposts for male behavior. They function less to describe women than to regulate them, praising submission and reproductive usefulness while stigmatizing sexual autonomy. When Peterson invokes it here, he promotes ancient historical control as timeless wisdom. The panel isn't neutrally describing archetypes here. They're trying to reinstate historical justification for limiting women. A modern ethical framework treats every human as full agents whose worth isn't contingent on purity, parenthood, or compliance with symbolic roles for moral drama.
Father donating a trifle to the process. Now, in Mary's case, that's obviously taken to the ultimate degree, but at minimum, it reflects this underlying biological reality. It's also the case that Mary, embodying as she does the spirit of motherhood, says yes to the fact of the child.
Consent isn't just about verbal agreement. It's also about power dynamics. Choices made under overwhelming authority, whether a commander, a teacher, an employer, or a divine being, don't carry the same ethical weight as choices made between equals. In the gospel story, Mary isn't negotiating with a peer. She's being addressed by God's messenger about a plan with cosmic and social consequences. If we treat this as a real scenario, Mary simply couldn't be in a position to consent.
There are parallels too. I mean, there's that moment in 2 Samuel where David leaps back at the presence of the ark. And some scholars think there's a parallelism here with John the Baptist leaping in the womb. There's a sort of a presence.
Again, a literary parallel is less likely to be historical reporting.
I think what's being indicated here already in a very
So on that, so he says a literary parallel is less likely to be historical reporting. I don't know. I feel skeptical of that.
fundamental sense is the inherently non-instrumental character of love itself, and so that you are fulfilled precisely in the transcending of your own fulfillment. And when Jesus says that my kingdom is not of this world, I mean, it seems to me what the scriptures are speaking to us of already here in the announcement of the angels about the pregnancy and birth of the children who will die deaths that are not for themselves is the radical self-othering that is the nature of self, you might say, the realization of the self in the deepest sense. And you see this in Christ at the very end. This is mirrored on the cross, where he is going to say, as his last act, as you might say, reconstituting that family between Mary and John, so that the ultimate act of self-othering is the principle that is able to bring together some harmony in us and in what is around us.
I'm sorry, what does that even mean?
This is a lot of words arranged on the fly to sound profound without ever making a claim you could agree or disagree with. It's not analysis, it's mood. Nothing is risked, nothing is argued. It's just a fog of reverent language that gestures vaguely at meaning without ever landing anywhere. The vast majority of this 2-hour panel is like the non-contributor at the work meeting, wasting 10 minutes pumping up the importance of a project that everyone's already agreed to, and is adding nothing actionable or clarifying.
If this story is so central, why is it absent from Mark, and why does Paul never talk about it? That's problematic. I mean, if it's such a central thing that you're claiming it is, Mark doesn't even consider it, and Paul never refers to it.
people write towards purposes, and so there are different reasons why you would include it and different reasons why you would exclude it. I mean, in the Gospels, it says, I think it's in the Gospel of John, where it says, all the books of the world cannot contain the story of Jesus. And so if we ask why is this person saying this detail and why this other person not saying this detail?
It's a good point, but what's arguably more problematic than Paul and Mark not including these foundational birth details is that Paul doesn't even appear to care about any aspect of Jesus' life. The only pre-death event Paul describes is Jesus having the Last Supper. No miracles, no healings, no parables or sermons, no ministry, no trial. It's tough to know which is more historically damning to the Gospels, that Paul didn't know or that Paul didn't care.
One of the things that's interesting, because your criticism is if it's so central, why isn't it replicated? And people have addressed that. But interestingly, despite the fact that it's not replicated, it's also become a really fundamental part of the culture of Christianity, right? Because there's nothing in many ways that people know more about Christ's life than the birth.
Another acknowledgement that the primary consideration for Christian foundations isn't historical accuracy, but rather novelty, popularity, and usefulness. Otherwise, Christians would apportion importance to the quality of the evidence.
In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. This was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. All went to be enrolled, each to his own city. And Joseph went up from Galilee, out of the town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David.
I have detailed videos on this, but the census in Luke 2 doesn't fit Roman history, Roman administration, or Roman chronology. There was a real census under Quirinius in AD 6, but Luke relocates it a decade earlier and reshapes it into a narrative device to get Jesus born in Bethlehem. None of these problems bother the panel. They don't say a peep.
Christ is born under the dominion of the state. That's the point of the census and the forced movement of people. The state has a tyrannical element. Every person, even the savior of the world, is born into a situation where they have to contend with the background tyranny of the state.
Sure, I could buy that. But again, this analysis advocates that these are story elements, not historical facts.
The next part is that...
And Augustus is the first God emperor. It's important to understand.
Right. So that's amplified, that fact. So we have the genuine God being born at a time when there's a false God who's emerged in the tyrannical state. That's a classic hero story.
Exactly. Classic hero story. Like so many other hero stories that came before and after.
Okay, so who's the true God here? Well, it's a babe, right? So is that every human baby with the potential to participate in the redemption of the world?
Okay, Jordan. Like, I get it, but really...
world, born in a very lowly place, well, that's a biological reality as well, because all human infants are incredibly threatened, right? Our infants are extremely dependent. They're very, very vulnerable. We're born under the tyranny of the state. We're born in relationship to nature and even low nature, and that's associated with the manger. So it's the emergence of the highest in the lowest as a counterposition to the false highest that's Augustus.
Yes. Christianity revels in the irony of a powerful God arriving as a vulnerable infant. But that irony only works because redemption is not something humans can achieve on their own. If every baby can redeem the world, as Peterson suggests, then Jesus wouldn't be essential.
Who gets wind of this? Well, it's not the people of the court. It's the shepherds, right? And the shepherds are an interesting choice, too, because, of course, shepherds... There's a kinship between the shepherd and the prophet all the way through the Old Testament, and that imagery is replicated continually in the New Testament.
There's a clearly, I think, a semi-conscious aping and mimicking of the language of the imperial cult to assert that Jesus is Lord and therefore Caesar isn't.
Once you admit that the shepherds are a symbolic literary choice and that the language is mimicking imperial propaganda, you've moved pretty far away from eyewitness reporting. The panel is quietly undermining how evangelicals usually want to read these texts.
So I'm just curious, and I really am curious. It's not a provocative question. It's, in fact, the first book I wrote is called The 9 Questions People Ask About Judaism, and one of the 9 questions is, if religion, specifically Judaism, is supposed to make people good, how do you account for unethical religious Jews?
Dennis, let's let that hang and get that back into that when we talk about the Pharisees. We can
I'm not sure they're the best example of bad guys.
No, but
I can't believe I'm saying this, but you get them, Dennis. It's historically misleading to use Pharisee as a stand-in for religious hypocrisy. The Pharisees were a major Second Temple Jewish movement committed to ethical rigor, scriptural interpretation, and everyday piety, arguably closer to Jesus' own worldview than most other groups of the time. Once Christianity began separating from Judaism, it reframed these Jewish interlocutors as immoral enemies. Invoking the Pharisees as a stock villain is a Christian anachronism.
we talked about this in Exodus. It's a difficult situation because in some ways it has to do with the problem of the one, and it's right. It has to do with the problem of the concentration of a generation into one person. It's a little scandalous to talk about it, but I think that is part of what is happening.
So the Magi tell Herod that a king will arise, and Herod determines to kill all the
babies.
Right, all the babies. And so that's equivalent to what happens in Moses' time. And it's another echoing of the idea.
And also Joseph, Joseph leaving his brothers that want to kill him into Egypt, but then also Moses leaving Egypt into the promised land. Those two get smashed into one image.
What they're describing here is midrash, a Jewish storytelling method where earlier scriptures are creatively woven together to generate meaning, not to preserve eyewitness testimony. Matthew's infancy story is a single-source narrative built by deliberately fusing Moses, Joseph, David, and Exodus imagery, which already raises historical red flags. Adding astrological symbolism only reinforces that we're in the realm of theological meaning-making, not reportage. When Pajot calls this scandalous, he's right. The scandal is that entire generations, architects, and epochs are being compressed into one symbolic figure. That's powerful theology, but it's not how history works.
There's also, there's extra biblical reference. They're magi. They're plausibly they're Zoroastrian.
Mm-hmm, right.
And there's been an ongoing relationship between Israel and Persia. And Persia figures I believe I read somewhere that Cyrus was actually one of the first people called Messiah in the Old Testament and King of Kings. And so there's also that relationship to, and Zoroastrianism is the idea that that the future has an openness to it, and we are a moral battleground in which that openness can be decided. And I think by having the Magi there is a recognition of that.
The panel is actually touching on a real and important observation from scholars of religion. During the Persian period in the 6th to 4th centuries BC, Jewish thought was being shaped by their cultures intermingling with Zoroastrianism. This is when ideas like cosmic moral struggle, a developed afterlife, resurrection, angels and demons, and a future eschatological judgment become prominent in Jewish texts. Even messianic language evolves in this context. Foreign King Cyrus the Great is explicitly called God's anointed, or Messiah, in the book of Isaiah. Friend of the channel CJ Cornthwaite recently spoke about this topic.
So Zoroastrianism is one of the oldest religions in the world. It's famously the religion of the Persian Empire. It would have been the religion of kings like Cyrus the Great. And Jews would have had a lot of contact with this religion, including their time spent in captivity, but also including the fact that it was a Zoroastrian king, Cyrus, who allowed for the rebuilding of the temple. So Zoroastrianism...
Yeah, Zoroastrianism is pretty cool. And yeah, you do have a lot of overlap in the ideas. And I think that from a Christian perspective, Zoroastrianism is probably one of the world religions that is closest to Christianity in a sense,
As religion has themes like light and darkness, it has the idea of apocalypse, the idea that you can see the future, has the ideas that the future can be revealed in dreams. We actually see this even in the book of Daniel, the famous story about King Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And in the Septuagint, this is not in the Hebrew Bible, but in the Septuagint, the translators of the Septuagint actually add in Magi as the people who Daniel is sort of warring against to interpret this famous dream by Nebuchadnezzar. Zoroastrians were also famously waiting for the coming of a Messiah. So there was so much contact between Zoroastrianism and Judaism, we can't even really untangle it. The History of Religion school about 100 years ago started to basically just say, oh, everything in Judaism is taken from Zoroastrianism. It doesn't seem that clear. They obviously impacted each other and had a long kind of standing tradition where they developed alongside each other. But nevertheless, that's kind of the context for who these Magi are.
He is also pointing out to his parents, who still don't understand this, that he's marked out for a very particular form of destiny. And so it's after that seriously starts to unfold, and that's where we'll pick up when we reconvene.
All right, that's a sudden end. That's it for Christmas, but there were 9 more episodes about the Gospels. What do you think? Would it be worth covering the rest of the seminar? Or have we already established that this panel seems very willing to undermine the historicity of the canonical stories about Jesus in the process of their analysis of the literary and utilitarian features of the gospel narrative? Let me know in the comments.
Thank you very much, everyone.
If you want to see more of this former Christian, taking a look at the...
I'm not impressed with Pelagius' take on things. Like, I don't think he's a good analyzer of the analysts. And like, maybe part of the reason for that is that his project is different from their project, right? Their project is, hey, let's figure out kind of this literary analysis. Whereas his project is a historical analysis. And so it's and so what happens is that literary analysis and historical analysis often don't get along very well, shall we say. All right, almost there. We've got to leave for work in a little bit. Pale Forest. We're going to do this time. Blah, ha, ha. This time what's going to happen is we're probably just going to nerd bowl up and proceed to do it. So what I want is I would like to get 12 to 16 of these. And once I get that, I'm going to be done with this biome. And if it happens to be night, it happens to be night. My mistake was putting the bed too far away. And so we'll probably make a tree, basically. So what I'm going to do is I'm probably going to make a checkerboard pattern with them. So I think what I'm probably going to do is I'm going to build a platform over the mushroom island that is built in this checkerboard pattern so that I can learn, so that I can figure out where the center of the island is. And from there, knowing where the center of the island is, we can figure out the exact distances to various points. And that's just going to require a fuck ton of slabs, I think. And probably what's going to happen Step 1, find a creaking. Step 2, hit creaking. Step 4, run. Hit creaking and run like a biatch. I really like these, like, not glowy, but some kind of glowy flowers. So I'm going to collect some of them, and hopefully we'll be able to replicate them. Oh, there we go. There is the creaking. Okay. And let's back away real slowly. There he is. My goal is to get far enough away that he deactivates. And I think we're far enough away now. Third pillar. Okay. That was not good. And I think that 4 is done. Charge respawn anchor. So that's the end of ZapMe 4. As you can see, I am not good.